Hello and welcome back to another podcast. Today I'm going to be talking with Stephen Dunne, who is a lecturer in psychology, and he also does a lot of research behind rehabilitation, long-term health, disability and well-being. And what's really good, he talks about vision impairment too, which is one of my greatest interests as well, because I'm visually impaired too. Thank you for joining me today, Stephen.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's been really exciting to talk to you about your research and stuff. So let's start by telling the listeners what your main areas of research are and what first led you to study things like brain injury, stroke recovery and hidden disability.
So perfectly summarised by itself. I do a lot of work with stroke survivors and brain injury survivors predominantly. I like to consider myself as someone who looks at optimising rehabilitation. That seems to be the kind of key focus of my research. With kind of a view of also understanding and raising awareness around hidden disability, which is where things like visual impairment comes into it. How it kind of started for me is when I was in a similar position to yourself as a uni student. I found I was reading a lot about different presentations of things that people would present with, either from a mental health perspective or from even having brain injury. But I'd never really understood how that would be in real life. I don't know, it never went far enough for me in the textbooks. And I never understood kind of the human side of things. So for me, it was all about understanding the person behind the problem, right? And I never felt we got that in lectures or in seminars. I don't know, hopefully none of our old lecturers are listening or anything, but I never felt I got that from being taught. So I started to do a lot of support work. So I did some voluntary support work and then became a paid support worker during my undergrad studies. And that kind of springboarded my love for actually understanding that, you know, these people who suffer from these issues are individuals. They're people in their own right who are going through something, and they go through adaptations and they have these issues, and it isn't just a case of reading about it in a textbook, but actually there are problems that these people face that can be resolved. So yeah, I found it quite fascinating to actually understand the people behind the issues, and I guess for me it was about personhood and who these people are. So I started to do a lot of work with brain injury charities and stroke charities in the Northeast. That led to more and more opportunities to be involved in different things. So I was doing research outside of my university degree, but in my support worker role, got an opportunity to become an assistant psychologist for a year as well, once I'd finished uni, working for a charity in the Northeast. And then I got dragged back into the murky world of research and academia late on to do a PhD, and that PhD was focused on visual impairment after stroke. So combining, I guess, your interest and kind of my interest around stroke and brain injury as well. So a lot of the work I started off doing was focused around stroke survivors, and specifically something called homonymous hemianopia, which is a visual impairment that is often missed when people who have a stroke first go into hospital. So as you can imagine, if someone has a stroke, they're dealing with a whole host of different issues, massive change to life, and also things like personality changes, but also their role in their family setup can change, their support networks can dwindle, everything. But the initial focus is always on things like mobility. How can we get that person back moving again? And often you end up missing, in that sort of 12-month golden period of rehabilitation, something like a visual impairment, because that person isn't navigating the world that they're normally in. So when they then are discharged and go home, they start bumping into things, they start falling over, and that's when you realise that they potentially have a visual impairment. And by that point, you've kind of missed a golden opportunity for rehabilitation. Terribly haven't explained what homonymous hemianopia actually is. So it's visual impairment where an individual can't see half of their visual field. So if you imagine when you cover one eye, you still have an entire view of, well, kind of a good view of the visual field. But if you were to lose half of your vision in both eyes to one side of the visual field, that can be incredibly debilitating. So someone can't see the left side or the right side of their visual field. So that's homogeneous hemianopia. And a lot of my research initially was around that, and how we can use sort of basic compensatory strategies to get people to see more of their visual field. And then from there, I moved into brain injury, stroke, a bit more focusing on the psychosocial side of things, loneliness, well-being, and then COVID happened and everyone got lonely. So loneliness became quite a big thing, and looked at social isolation following vision impairment. And then now more recently, we'll hopefully discuss it a bit later, but projects around how we can improve the lives of individuals who have these kind of vision impairments or other associated issues following a stroke and a brain injury via things like peer support, so someone with lived experience assisting that person. It's a really convoluted way of talking about my research interests, but that is basically the long journey from undergrad to now from my research.
That's really interesting, and thank you for sharing all of that too. There's also, I don't know, I'm just saying this on my listeners' point of view. There's a charity called Look, where it's based on mentor support and stuff. Don't know if you've heard of it.
No, I haven't, no.
But I think it's where somebody else visually impaired can also speak to somebody else visually impaired who's struggling because they've either like lost their vision recently or whatever. And I believe you've got to be over a certain age limit to be a volunteer, but I'm not too sure about who actually wants to speak to somebody if there's an age limit on that. I think it's over 19, but I'll look that up and probably put it in the comment or something, like the description box and stuff, something.
That is fascinating, because a lot of the research that we do, or that I've done with the teams that I work with, have shown that when you talk to someone who's had a vision impairment following a stroke specifically, the peer support is one of the most important things. So having the support from someone who is going through a similar kind of thing, understands maybe more so than a family member or a loved one, and probably more so than a doctor can tell you so much, but they haven't been through it, is incredibly important for someone's rehabilitation or even just their well-being, in terms of having someone that understands and they feel seen. So yeah, that's amazing. I'll look into that charity myself.
I can completely agree anyway, because with losing my sight at the age of 14, I realised that I had to really look at YouTube videos, say, and look at Lucy Edwards and all the influencers that have actually been through vision loss, and look at lived experience too, because not many people understand vision impairment at all unless they go through it or they're really research into it and stuff like that. And you've got to actually go through it yourself and know about it. There's so much stigma around vision impairment, a lot, and it's actually quite shocking how it can just escalate the stigma into something else, and you're not even allowed to say watch. I just did that, and people are like, oh, you watched it? And it's honestly, it's so entirely stigmatized. Have you found that?
Yeah, I think more so now with the projects that we're doing. So a lot of my work has been done obviously with stroke survivors with a visual impairment. So we're still talking about visual impairment, but I guess quite a very specific type of visual impairment, often this homogeneous hemianopia. And they always, I say always, it's quite reductive, but every time I've had a conversation, either through anecdotally, having just general conversations with individuals who have these issues, or for research projects, what we always find is the same kind of things come up from a qualitative perspective. So the experiences that people with these vision impairments have is that they don't feel seen at all. There's a complete lack of awareness around what a visual impairment is, and then also I guess how to treat someone with a visual impairment. Often the stigmatizing way that they're treated, it's not a case of sometimes it's not even a case that they're treated like a normal person. It's just they're just treated like someone different. There needs to be a different level of treatment for that person because of the lack of understanding. So it's just I feel like I'd like to hope that in the 20 years that I've been doing this research, things have got better and awareness has increased and improved. But I still think there are massive issues with how visual impairment is understood, and that's one of one of my PhD students is actually looking at that specifically. So, attitudes and awareness of visual impairment and how we can potentially create or look to create some type of intervention to reduce this stigma or improve understanding among the general public, to try and stop that feeling of otherness around visual impairment. So yeah, in answer to your question, yes. The short answer is yes. That people do say this quite a lot. That there is this very real stigma and different way of being treated. This feeling of other.
Yeah, there's loads of people in the community as well, and it's just trying to reduce that stigma and actually be treated like a actual human being as well.
Yeah.
And people even walk around and either speak to somebody you're with or speak to you really slowly and loudly, and I'm just like, why? I can hear myself and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, the thought process that happens.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, it's mind blowing something. But but moving on. Looking at your published work, what have you been what has been most important with the findings or results from your studies so far? And what did you discover that matters most to people?
So I think a lot of my work, the way that I try and do research is that there is some level of impact or something that you can take away from it and apply elsewhere. One of the key things that keeps coming up and up and up in my work, which I'm now at a point where, looking back at the sort of back catalogue of publications, I'm like, okay, maybe this is something I need to focus on as an intervention, is peer support. So like I said, that, like you spoke about with the charity and these forms of peer support where you have someone with a lived experience also assisting someone going through a similar thing, has a massive impact on that person. It can make them feel less alone, less socially isolated, improve well-being, reduce stress, having that feeling of giving someone hope because they can see where they may be further down the journey of rehabilitation, or giving someone the opportunity to feel understood because they feel that their family can't do that for them anymore because they actually haven't lived through it, so they don't know what they're going through. And also from a family side of things as well, peer support seems to not just help the individual, but can also be used as a barometer for the family to know, okay, this is where we're at now, but this is where we could be in a couple of months' time or a couple of years' time down the line, and that just I guess kind of like normalising the process of adapting to change. So peer support seems to be something that it's come up in like so many of my publications, so much of my research. When you're talking to people, they always talk about how important it was to feel understood by someone, to feel seen by someone. And that's where that peer support process comes in. So in terms of important findings, that is the one that is the most consistent in what I've done and seems to be one of the ones that we could try and operationalise most from an intervention perspective. So, having people who have gone through similar things talk to people about it who are at the start of their journey or, feel like they're losing their way in their journey, it can be incredibly important and helpful.
Yeah, definitely, totally agreed. I'm going to also mention another charity. It's called RSBC, Royal Society for Blind Children. It's based in London, but you can also join online video calls with them and stuff like that. I've been a part of Sisterhood since I lost my vision. And it's honestly a great charity. I've been in a podcast actually with them on their channel too, talking about sisterhood, and I'll share the link as well afterwards to you all because I've been meaning to do that and this is a perfect time to mention it. So I'll put the link down, but honestly it's a great charity. they're up to the age of 25, I'm pretty sure. They don't just do sisterhood, they've got like WhatsApp groups and everything like that. They've even got a boys club and book club, you name it, they've got everything. And honestly, they're great. But yeah, so you used a method with reflexive thematic analysis and mixed methods, which we've also learned about in psychology in my course. So how did these methods help you get those findings, and what did they show you that other approaches might have missed?
Yeah, so I never started off as a qualitative researcher, so I consider myself now to be to some extent a mixed methodologist. So, you use the tool that's right for the job. It's just that a lot of the time in the work that I do, when you're talking about things like lived experience and you're talking about people, it's very, very hard to find any answers if you are looking at numbers, self-report data or surveys and questionnaires. You can obviously, if you want to look at a larger kind of scoping situation, then surveys and that kind of data is incredibly useful. And don't get me wrong, I don't hate quantitative. I still use it, but I'm a massive fan of using qualitative interviewing and qualitative techniques where possible, because I think you can get more to the heart of a particular question. So it's just using the right tool for the job. But I'm way more of a qualitative researcher these days than I ever used to be. And with the type of questions that we're asking, where we're looking at people's experiences of certain things and trying to understand particular issues, qualitative techniques are just perfect for that. You can also have those conversations and you have a level of inherent flexibility, which you'll come to learn as you learn more about sort of things like reflexive thematic analysis and qualitative techniques, where you can have a conversation. When you use the word interview, it sounds incredibly formal, right? But what we're doing now is we're having a conversation. This is kind of how I would expect it to be for a qualitative interview, right? If I was to say something, which I already have, we've gone off on sort of two different tangents already. Like, that is a qualitative interview, and that is data that you can't get from a survey or from a self-report measure, or from someone clicking a button whilst looking at a particular experimental stimuli. So for me, it's perfect for collecting the types of data that we're talking about, where you can find those kind of really powerful personal experiences and use that to try and, I guess, build something from the ground up. In my case, build interventions or build an understanding of what is optimal for a particular rehabilitation strategy or whatever. I think it just basically comes down to understanding the person. I like talking to people as well, and I think that's the best way to figure out what's going on, is having a conversation. So if someone is willing to talk to you, obviously, but yeah.
Definitely, I completely agree with that. And it brings like that wide perspective as well. Like, you can't just, like, if you do like an online form, for example, there's not much to it really, to be honest with you. And for people who are listening who doesn't really know what a thematic analysis is you have this specific data transcribed from like your one-to-one conversation or focus group, and basically you pick out different themes that have showed up the most in your codes. So vision impairment research, it could be something like socialisation or whatever, and stuff like that. So I just thought I'd put it out there, because thematic analysis, when I first got taught about it, I was like, oh, what's that? It's such like a big, massive, like, thematic analysis is like a big like thing, but like it's so like a wide range of like descriptions that you're just like, oh, I don't know what to do. So I just thought I'd explain it to the people who might not have known that. Do you want to add anything else before I...
Yeah, I think people find it... So I actually I think it's changed over the years, but I think people are scared of qualitative analysis, like things like thematic analysis. because it's in some ways it's easier to look at data and run an analysis on it. You know, you're looking at like running a t-test, so like comparing two sets of data and seeing whether one is smaller or bigger than the other. It's sometimes is easier than delving into 10 people's conversations, 10 people's transcripts, and then you yourself having to try and interpret what's going on. And I think sometimes that's where people try to not avoid, but don't really use qualitative as much, because there is a level of interpretation. So if we were both looking at the same data set, your experiences as someone who's visually impaired would be very different when you're interpreting, you know, a visual impairment, 10 transcripts, for example, than mine. And I think it's that understanding of there is an inherent level of difference depending on who is analysing the data, which is sometimes hard to get your head around, but it only makes for a richer analysis. That's just part of the process. So, yeah.
And it takes such a long time to do a semantic analysis.
Yeah.
I only had 3 themes on one thing, and I was like, oh my goodness me, this is going to take about an hour.
Yeah, it takes a while.
I do like qualitative research. I love a lot of rich data. I love me like themes that I can pick through and everything like that. Quantitative, it depends. If I want to do the standard deviation, I'm just like, oh no. But if I want to look at like the correlation and stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, that's all right.
It's the right tool for the job, right? So it all comes down to your question, your research question. And like I say, like a lot of the time for me, I prefer mixed methodology, right? So you can answer the same question in different ways as well. So let's say, for example, I wanted to look at attitudes and awareness of visual impairment, very, very broad. I could do a nationwide survey to try and understand what are the general public's attitudes towards individuals who are visually impaired or their awareness of visual impairment. And then I could also interview 10 of them, or from people from different backgrounds, to try and understand a bit further about why they have those attitudes and beliefs, where they've got them from. So you can kind of marry those. That's what I mean. Mixed methods for me is ideal, because you can answer different facets of the same question in a much more in-depth way. So I'm not hating on either method, or not saying one is more superior to the other. It's definitely picking the right tool for the job.
Yeah, I love mixed methods, me, because then you can get both sides really.
Yeah.
And then you can even pick out your quantitative data questions, what really like stuck out the most, into the qualitative like interviews and stuff like that, and make it more like a wider range of like data you get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was going to ask you about mixed methods, and you must have read me mind.
There you go, yeah.
So one of your studies looks at the bridging the care in brain injury rehabilitation. What were the main findings from this research, and what did it tell us about what support is really needed?
Yeah, so this is an ongoing project as well. So this is one publication from a series of projects that we're hoping to run this year and onwards. This was the first one. So like I say, this comes back to peer support and where my research interests are at the moment. So I've been working with Northumberland Head Injury Services, based in Morpeth, and their excellent psychology team and staff team there. And this particular project they were in the process of hiring a peer supporter. So I want to say this with a caveat that I'm aware of. They're the only NHS service in the UK that is hiring or has now hired a neurological peer supporter. So peer support exists within the NHS. There's a big structure around mental health peer supporters, people who have experience with particular mental health conditions, helping those on mental health wards as well who are going through similar experiences. This is the first case of someone with a brain injury doing that in the NHS. So it's an amazing opportunity to be involved in sort of research at the ground level, focusing on peer support in neurological services. This project started before they hired that person. So this particular project was looking at the perspectives of staff members within that service before they hired that person. How did they feel that person was going to integrate with the service? integrate with the NHS as an organisation? Because obviously there's things to consider there. How do they find the right candidate? Are there any issues or barriers that they can see around that process of hiring and integration into the service? And I guess then also the positive side of things, of like, what do they think a peer supporter, someone with a neurological condition, can do to assist them in their jobs, but also the service itself. So we did some qualitative work, we did some interviews with the staff there, and it was really interesting actually. We found some quite nice stuff. So there were three main themes. There was the perfect candidate. I'll go through these just as when I get a chance, but there was the perfect candidate, there was the context for success was the second theme, and then there was connecting care was the third theme. So the perfect candidate as a theme was around the individual themselves. So how do you find the right person? Brain injury is such a vast thing, a vast array of symptoms and sequelae that can happen. So how do you find the right person that can connect across as many people as possible in that service who are experiencing a range of different things, but also then function within the organisation of the NHS? The context for success was a focus on the team themselves. So is that team right to support that person? Is this the right time to hire someone within that role? The NHS as an organisation requires things like confidentiality. Did they believe, like, one of the things that was questioned was whether someone with a brain injury would be able to maintain that level of confidentiality if potentially they hire someone with memory issues, for example. And it was all about, navigating the particular symptomology that someone with a brain injury can experience, but then how that would fit within an NHS service and the kind of guidelines that are required to work within the NHS. And then the final theme is connecting care, was a really positive one, around the benefits that this person, at this point in time, this unnamed person would have, because they always feel that they are, like I say, like having conversations with people about experiences that they've never had themselves and trying to connect to those people and say, this is where you can be in 12 months' time, in 18 months' time, if you follow this plan or if you do these things, because I've seen it happen before. But it's easier to do that if someone is saying, I did that, I was there 18 months ago and now I'm here because I followed this plan. It's that peer support, right? That lived experience. So it was a really, really interesting project, and the key takeaway from it was that they were so ready and so willing and so supportive as a team to have someone with a brain injury assist them from a peer support perspective. But it was just whether or not the infrastructure could support them as well. There was some kind of side interesting findings as well around, like I said, like mental health peer support exists in the NHS, and there was all this training for mental health peer supporters, and they tried to provide that training to the service, but it's like, you're not hiring a mental health peer supporter, you're hiring someone who's going to be dealing with people who have a brain injury. So it's a completely different set of circumstances and a completely different set of training that's required, but the training just didn't feel like it was right for that job. So there seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done. This is where the project is heading now. There seems to be a lot of work that needs to be done around, firstly, evaluating, now that person's in post, is the role right? Does it work? Who does it work for best and when? And then the other side of it is, if other services want to look at doing this as well, how do they do it from start to finish, right? Because there was a lot of red tape NHS stuff that the psychology team had to go through to get that person in post. They had to write their own interview schedule, because the one that exists for mental health peer supporters doesn't work for neurological peer supporters. So there's like all these different things to consider. So it sort of led to these kind of like next steps of a project looking to evaluate that role for clients, does it work for them? Family members, does it work for them? The peer supporter themselves, are they enjoying the role? Can they manage the role? Is it okay for them as well? Are they growing in confidence and well-being and quality of life as well? And then the service itself. Is the service benefiting from having this person in post? And then the other side of it is a project looking at, what did that service actually do to achieve getting a person into that role? And can we build a framework that other NHS services can look at if they also want to do that? So, yeah, it was a really, really nice project that's led to really nice collaborative relationship between an NHS trust and also now hopefully for the benefit of other individuals going through rehabilitation from brain injury in that service and beyond. Fingers crossed.
That's great. It's really interesting, that.
Thank you.
Love hearing about that, actually. And it leads perfectly, actually, into the main question of once you have your findings and your results, how do you then actually implement them into like the real world? So what does it mean to take what you found in a study and put it into the actual practice of things?
There's a number of different ways. So implementing your findings, often I think people think that means publishing the paper and then the paper's out there. Great, we can look at the findings. I've never been that way inclined. So for me, it's always about what can you do with those findings and where can you take them. So the natural stuff is things like dissemination. So you want to get the findings out there, you want to talk to the right people and put yourself in the right positions so that they know what those findings are. So if they just exist in a journal somewhere, they're not helping anyone. So for me, personally, a lot of the time what I end up doing is trying to find the right dissemination routes. So on these brain injury projects, it isn't just me as a lone researcher working on them. Often I'll have started the process by talking to other people, researchers, staff within the NHS, within that particular service, but the key one being brain injury survivors themselves, and asking them what are the best routes for dissemination, where's the best place to take this, who's the best people to talk to, how would you change this, right? I'm a researcher, I'm not someone who's had a brain injury, so I could be asking completely the wrong question to start off with. So those routes into how to make your findings impactful and where to put your findings at the end start at the beginning. You have to figure out the pathways and the right people to talk to there, because they should be then guiding you the whole way through. So with this project that I spoke about specifically, I feel like that paper that we published is just the start, and the findings aren't going to be seen. They're not going to be implemented for a long time. Probably like 4 years, I reckon, 5 years if we can get around to it properly, because that was one project to try and build into a larger series of projects. The key for me is what comes next. So that evaluation is going to be critical, because that will be a case of, okay, we want to know whether it works. I'm just taking that as an example, but we want to know whether that role works, that peer supporter role works. Fantastic. Once we have that data, we'll have a really, really good understanding of, does it work, who it works for, hopefully when it works best as well, because obviously it could be a case that it works best when a particular person is aligned with the peer supporter. So is it a case that the person has to have the same symptomology that the peer supporter has to make it work best? The person has to be receptive and they have to engage, because there are people who enter rehabilitation and for brain injury, for example, and they're not ready. And it's the same with stroke as well. So there are those kind of minute details to try and understand and optimise the process. And the other side of it is that framework. We'll know when that's worked because we've put a framework out and people are looking at it and going, oh, we could probably try and get someone like this in our service too. And then they look at hopefully the evaluation data and they're like, because it works. Or it works in this position, so we can use this. So for me, it's all about feeding it back to where it's going to have the most impact. And that is often not, I don't want to say this as someone obviously doing a degree in psychology now, that often isn't a dusty journal somewhere. Often that is the dissemination that happens afterwards. So the paper is one part of it, but the other side of it is actually talking at conferences. For me, I like to talk to stroke groups specifically, or brain injury groups, or sometimes within the NHS they'll have certain research groups that you can go and speak to as well and talk to. So talking to the right people, to patient groups, to clinicians, getting the message out there, doing things like this. I'm having a conversation with you who's an interested party. I assume some of your listeners might be interested in this work too. So you never know who's listening. So I think it's like having those conversations and getting your work out there. And then the knock-on effects of those things are potentially looking at things like policy as well. So, for me, there's stroke guidelines that have changed as a consequence of some of the visual rehabilitation work we've done. So when I was talking about homonymous hemianopia earlier, we did a load of studies in the lab which looked at particular types of training for that visual problem. And then since then, stroke guidelines have been updated to suggest that type of training, compensatory training, could be useful for stroke. So it could be useful for visual problems after stroke. So there's a number of different things that you can do. It's just about making it. Firstly, I think I'll boil it down to having a targeted plan from the start, keeping the right people involved, and that doesn't just mean a research team. That's often the people you're trying to work with and help as well. And then looking at things like where is it going to have the most impact, or who can you talk to that's going to have the most impact later on with your findings. And often that isn't publishing a paper, as much as that's part of the job. That's one part of the job, I think. And then the rest is about, well, how can you get this out into the community? Or what can you do with these findings?
Definitely, I completely agree with that. And I was talking to a PhD student actually, and one of her things is about actually having the individual share their points on like how can this research go on to further like research projects and stuff, which is really great, really, to be honest with you, because there's not many studies that actually look at the individual and think, what do they actually think is the most important for research to? So that's really great that you're doing that as well.
Yeah, there's so the two things off the back of that are, you may not have heard of this yet in the course, but hopefully you will at some point, right? So myself, Cara, the PhD student, we're big advocates of things like called PPIE, which is patient and public involvement and engagement, right? And that is the thing you should always start with. For me, like I say, as a researcher without lived experience, I have an understanding from 20 years of research in stroke and brain injury, but I still might not be asking the right question. So if I have an idea for a project, the best thing I can do is talk to people about it. And I mean, if it's a stroke-related project, I should probably be talking to stroke survivors and carers, because hopefully the work that I'm doing will be of benefit to them. Just before I came to this podcast, I was having a conversation with a stroke group and a brain injury group around the project that I spoke about, the peer support project, because I was really interested to understand their views. And I really want to understand whether or not I'm asking the right question and whether I'm looking at the right outcome measures. So at the moment for me, I'm looking at things like confidence, well-being, quality of life. But they themselves have said, well, have you thought about kind of the practical, today, literally an hour ago, have you thought about the practical things that can be helpful as well? For example, what you're not picking up in that is, for me, when I was going through my stroke, I was unable to fill out forms. And that was a real problem with things like PIP and disability. And that is something that the peer supporter could help them with. But that's not going to show up in a confidence or a well-being measure. It might show up in a well-being measure, but it's not going to show up in some of those outcome measures. So even having those conversations with people now at the start of this project is really important for understanding, yeah, I think I'm asking the right question, but maybe I've not thought about the right outcomes, or I'm not asking the right outcome measure questions. So it's getting that feedback on the ground initially to really target what is going to be most important to the people who are going to be hopefully benefiting from the work that you're doing. And that has always been, I think, something that we've tried to push forward with our research.
Definitely, completely agree. So a big interest of mine is around accessibility and visual impairment. So have your studies found any key things about the experiences, the barriers or the support needs of people living with visual impairment or sight loss?
One of the things that always seems to come up is lack of support. It just seems to be the constant. So often I'll have conversations, actually to be fair, throughout all of my projects it seems to be relevant, but predominantly with visual impairment. With the stroke survivors that I work with, the visual impairment side of things, often people fall through the gaps because it's one of the last things that's found. So if someone presents with a kind of like right-sided weakness, then that's the thing that we focused on in rehabilitation to start off with, because it means that they can get them mobile, they can get them walking again, you can resolve those more like visually, pardon the pun, but like those sort of visually available things that you can see, the symptomology you can see. And often what's missed is then the visual impairment. And there is considered to be this kind of golden rehabilitation window after a stroke. whereby, you've had this sort of massive trauma to your brain, and these new neural pathways are now connecting to kind of, bridge those gaps. And the kind of understanding is that you have, or people are told, which is also quite frustrating, because people are often told that, you have kind of a 12 to 18 month window of like really strong rehabilitation time, where you're making all these new neural connections, and that's where you're going to be progressing significantly, and then you'll plateau. And if you're telling someone that in 12 months or so they're going to plateau in their rehabilitation, you imagine how like debilitating that is to hear. And then also when you've told that, and then they miss a visual impairment, let's say, so you've missed a golden window of rehabilitation. Often what I've heard from the stroke survivors I speak to is that, it's just like, I missed that golden window, what's the point? And that's really frustrating to hear, particularly because it's not always the case. There is still room for improve. Like, people can still improve. So it's a really problematic way of framing rehabilitation. So that is one of the biggest issues. The way that rehabilitation is framed, I think, from speaking to stroke survivors with a visual impairment, is hard because it can instantly knock their engagement in rehabilitation, and you need someone engaged and motivated in the process in order to improve recovery. And then the other side of things is missing the visual impairment generally as well, or people falling through support gaps. And that is the case not just for stroke survivors with visual impairment generally, that it does still feel like a bit of a lottery sometimes. Some people have access to certain things that other people don't, based on a postcode, or based on what hospital they're in, or who they're talking to. And that shouldn't be the case. It should be a more uniform pathway without people falling through the gaps. But I've been doing this for 15 years, 20 years now, and it always feels like that is the same thing that keeps coming up, is that, I didn't have access to this, or I missed out because of this, or whatever. Yeah, it's just really, really hard. One of the things as well, I think, is that you can only do so much with the NHS. So there are such short windows for really targeted and specific rehabilitation. So just taking stroke generally and not visual impairment, things like access to a speech and language therapist, you might have that for sort of 3 months, and then that person might move on or leave, or they've not got the funding to keep doing that. So it's like, okay, well then that rehabilitation just stops then. And often this is why things like the Stroke Association are quite useful, because they have a range of different community groups that exist once someone's discharged and people can go to. But again, what you're looking at there is the hope that there is a community group that's near you, that you can, you have the mobility to get to as well, and the access to, because otherwise you are just sort of on your own, you're isolated. And I think that's the biggest problem, is these kind of gaps in support, both within the pathway itself, but also regionally, based on postcode, or based on the symptomology that someone has. And I don't know, in a perfect world, that just would not exist. You just would hope that there would be this uniform pathway that everyone could have the access to.
Yeah, definitely. So when you're designing your studies and collecting the data, what have you found that works the best to make sure people with vision impairments can take part fully and share their views equally?
So I probably jumped the gun a little bit, but I spoke about PPIE, so public and patient involvement and engagement. And this is something that we always try and build in at the start of a project. And that should be addressing things like that. That should be addressing things like accessibility, barriers to inclusivity. And you're having these conversations with people who you are hoping to recruit from that population, and therefore understand what may stop these people from getting involved in the study, or are there better ways of asking certain questions, or better methods of collecting data. So again, another example from the conversation I had about an hour ago is I was talking about doing some qualitative methodology, and the group that I was speaking to spoke about the particular qualitative methods I was looking at using were things like interviews and focus groups, but they spoke about them potentially being quite intensive, because I wanted to do quite a few of them. So they suggested, why not use something like voice memos instead? So firing someone a question on WhatsApp and letting them just, as and when they can, with a level of flexibility, do an audio recording back, which would be something, as a researcher, you don't really think about that, because you think of more formal ways of collecting data, but data doesn't have to be this kind of like really strict way of collecting data. Data is data sometimes, and I guess it's more about getting the data and getting the data in the right way than getting sort of this perfect, controlled level of data collection. So yeah, so things like that are really, really useful. So having, trying to address those barriers to inclusivity and those barriers to participation early doors through things like PPIE are incredibly important for every project, but I try and use them quite a lot in my projects as well. Co-production is another term that you might not have come across yet, but you probably will do quite heavily. So that isn't just a case of like talking to people and saying like, what do you think about this from a population you're interested in, but actually having people with lived experience as researchers on the project too, right? Not just having a voice, but being a voice in the entirety of the project, and co-producing the research with you. So co-creating the research from both, from the start in terms of the design, the methods you're going to use, being involved in collecting the data. Sometimes it's significantly easier, like I say, peer support side of things, having someone with lived experience collecting that data and being in an interview, than having me as a dusty researcher who you view as someone who's been parachuted in with a clipboard, having a chat with you. Like, who are you going to talk to? The person who has a vision impairment, and maybe has a great level of understanding, or the person who's called doctor and might look like a stuffy researcher? I know who I would rather talk to. So, it's making sure that you are doing the right things. I think in those, I've said it a couple of times, I've probably hammered it on the head a bit too much, but it's making sure in those early phases that you're doing the right things to kind of remove those barriers. And like with the vision impairment stuff, so with Kara's PhD, she's done a lot of work around PPIE, with sending, and I know you've been involved in it as well, with sending out these PPIE packs of the project that she's thinking of doing, asking for feedback on it, and asking whether or not things like materials are accessible, which has been amazing, because obviously as researchers we write stuff, but we write in a language that probably isn't accessible to everyone, and or even simply like for a visual impairment study, making sure that people can read and access the information is incredibly important. So yeah, it's those considerations that need to be taken into account at the start of a project that I think then will see you through for the entire thing, and you can set those up early and make sure that they are part of the project from the start.
Yeah, definitely. And there's even like image descriptions as well.
Yeah.
That's honestly, it's like just great that like you have thought about a lot during your PPIE.
Yeah, PPIE.
Yeah, almost forgot the acronym.
There's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah.
So.
But honestly, it's great how you're thinking about like how do you actually make things accessible for people who are visually impaired, and it's even to say like the questions, like even you can even change the questions around to make it like less upsetting, for example, because somebody might have lost a vision like a couple of years back and it's still quite like mentally
raw, right?
Yeah. So just changing around the questions to make it more like not mentally raw.
Yeah.
It's even that as well. So do you want anything to add before I move on?
No, it's good.
Great. So you also did work on loneliness and well-being after illness. Did your findings show us anything about how vision impairment can affect social life and mental health, and what helps most?
Yeah, I think with the loneliness and social isolation stuff, there's a lot around kind of support networks dwindling, so like friends and family. There was a lot I think some of those findings were around sort of friends, like a lack of family understanding sometimes for certain things, leading to further social isolation, but also things like social circles dwindling. And again, I'll come back to sort of like looking at it specifically from stroke and visual impairment from my perspective, but when someone has a stroke, there is really a lot of literature to suggest that social circles diminish quite dramatically. A lot of people, because obviously I think people start off being there, and then because it's a long process and someone is adapting to a new normal, and they may never achieve, where it's unlikely they'll get back to the person they specifically were before, because it's such a traumatic change. A lot of friends and the social circles in that regard will diminish over time. which is obviously incredibly hard and can leave people withdrawn and socially isolated. We did a lot of work with, particularly during COVID, around this as well. And it was a bit of a mixed bag. So there was the report. We did some work on loneliness, actually, really well timed prior to COVID. So we did a study looking at how stroke survivors with vision impairment define, like, what did loneliness mean to them? How did they define loneliness? Which hadn't been done before, and it was really interesting, kind of like, I guess, navigate, like, you talk about sensitive topics and being mentally raw, hearing those kind of things. And I guess one of the interesting findings from that was that we used mixed methods again. We used quantitative measures of loneliness, really well-renowned ones. And on those measures, these stroke survivors were coming out as not being lonely. They're clinically not lonely. But when we were having these conversations with them, they were so lonely. They were talking about, how socially isolated they felt, and like how withdrawn they were from society, and how they felt stigmatized. Everything we've already spoken about in this podcast, and it really hit home to us how bad these self-report measures. When we talk about the difference between quant and qual data, how bad these self-report measures are sometimes, like loneliness, to measure these things in chronic illness populations. So yeah, it's I've probably gone really off tangent there in terms of like what it can tell us about visual impairment, but from a kind of like a social isolation and loneliness side of things, the support network seems to be incredibly important. So it can be quite a good maintenance factor, but it can diminish as well, because of, I guess, like we come back to like a lack of understanding and awareness around how long a rehabilitation period there may be, where that person may get back to in terms of who they were before. And the COVID example is quite a good one for that, because a lot of people found that they were able to maintain social networks to some extent because they were able to go for walks on a one-to-one basis with someone. Because if you remember when lockdown happened, but then we were allowed out for a little bit, we were able to go to natural spaces and have walks, but we still couldn't go to pubs and things, but we could have walks with other people. And that led to kind of a boost in social networks a little bit for the chronic illness populations I dealt with. But then as soon as things opened up again, and people went back to a level of normality, stroke survivors where they didn't feel comfortable, or people with a visual impairment and stroke didn't feel comfortable hanging out in a pub anymore, because of the noisy nature of them having to navigate an unfamiliar space, for example. But their friends then did go back to the pub. Well, they were back to where they were before. So I think they felt this kind of like a slight reprieve initially, during that period of time, but then back to a level of social isolation and loneliness once things opened up and got back to normal again, which felt like a bit of a kick in the teeth to the people that I spoke to.
Yeah, definitely. And even people in general with vision impairment, I've known quite a few people say to me, I've lost friends during the process and stuff like that. And I completely agree as well. And honestly, it's like you say, it's a lack of understanding. And I think people are almost scared about vision impairment and stroke and stuff like that, other hidden disabilities, and what they need to actually do to help that person. And you're still the exact same person. I'm still the exact same person from before I lost my sight to now, but without the sight, if that makes sense. So I would really think that would come out the most during your loneliness studies and stuff like that, because it's probably one of the most things I hear that happens, and it's quite shocking actually how people have that experience. But do you want to add anything before?
I think the only thing I would add is that I think the reason why is that people have a life goes on mentality of just, I don't know, I feel like that people can be quite short-minded, so there isn't there's this combination of a lack of understanding that exists, which it just does for a range of different chronic illnesses or visual impairment, for example. And people initially may show some level of understanding, but then if they're not following through with that, it just kind of, life goes on, and people focus on sort of their own little bubble, don't they? Which I think can leave people behind. And I think it all comes back to this lack of awareness, lack of understanding. That's what I found throughout my research anyway.
Yeah, definitely, and I agree. Not even on a research point of view, I can just agree with talking to people.
Yeah.
So your large mindfulness study was published in Nature Human Behaviour. So what were the main findings from that work, and how can these results help improve well-being for everyone, including those with disabilities?
Yeah, this was a big team science project I was a part of. So there were 37 sites. I think it was something like 2,200 participants, so like a massive amount of data. And what we were interested in was looking at whether, those kind of like sort of readily available internet-based kind of like apps for stress reduction, like mindfulness, basically, or those small videos you can find on YouTube, whether that are meant to improve mindfulness, whether they can have an impact on reduction of stress. So we had this a number of different sites around the world looking at this, and combined our data, just pulled our data. So we had like a really big resource of data, and we had 4 different kind of like tasks, 4 different app tasks that people could do from a mindfulness perspective, readily available, like a YouTube video, an app that basically focus on your breathing, improving mindfulness, versus a control group, which was an active control group, so not just like a group of people who weren't doing anything, a group of people who just like listen to music. And we found, I thought the findings were actually really interesting. So what we found was that those 4 groups, so that the individual people who looked at those 4 different tools for mindfulness, there was this significant reduction in stress compared to the control group. Which is really interesting. It's a nice finding. Where I quite like it is that it kind of, from a disability perspective or from a visual impairment perspective, if we're talking about people, or hidden disability, if we're talking about people who may struggle to get to a clinic, or may struggle to have access to a particular resource, these were very, very readily available, low cost, zero barriers to entry really, apart from maybe having an internet connection, access to like a tablet or a phone, and they were able to reduce stress significantly compared to an active control group. So people who may struggle, for example, individuals with a disability, to get to a clinic or to take part in certain things, they could use these types of things at home, and it will have a reduction in their stress and boost their mindfulness. So it's a really nice study. I mean, there are some limitations to consider as well. The sample was quite heavily focused on, I think there was a large population of females, and also, to caveat it, I'm not saying that these studies, these sort of apps and things, I'm not promoting them and saying that they are great for boosting mindfulness. It was an interesting finding that potentially can springboard into other things, and means that these types of things could potentially be useful from a stress reduction perspective. And like I said, the fascinating thing for me is that there is kind of zero barriers to use. Like these things are just available. So if you would like to give them a go, they could work. They could have a not a pronounced impact, but they could have an impact on your stress and reduce your stress. So really interesting stuff.
It is, and just to put it out there, I had a podcast last week with what's he called again? Michael Smith.
Yeah.
And he talks about expressive writing, and that's another technique that you can also use with mindfulness too. If you don't want to listen to like a track, you can also write down your feelings and stuff, whatever works for you. There's also on my videos as well, speak a lot about like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique and all that, and it can actually reduce stress as well. So it's just finding the right technique for you. Do you want to add anything before?
No, that's everything for me.
Great. So what is the most surprising or powerful finding you have ever had from your research, and why did it change how you think about supporting people?
Do you know what the one for me is that there's a quote from a study that I just I do find myself just thinking about sometimes. So it was from a study that we did during COVID. So it was as we were coming out of COVID. So things were starting to reopen again, and we did some interviews. We were looking at loneliness and social isolation in a group of stroke survivors, and one of the quotes that someone said was related to a theme about returning to normality. So the stroke survivor said that basically the stroke survivor had spoken about how during, just for context, spoken about during COVID, like I said, like things felt a bit easier for them, and that wasn't the experience of everyone. But for this person, what they felt like was that because things were locked down, there was just a bit more peace in their mind. In that there wasn't, people weren't, it didn't feel like there was any pressure on them to get better. It didn't feel like there was any pressure on them from, other people around them or family members or friends or whoever to improve in any way. It just felt like there was a sort of a state, like a hold state, a stasis, and they were at peace with that. They just felt like, oh, this is okay. Like I'm sort of just living day to day. That's fine. Like this is not, I haven't had this for years, because everyone was in the same boat. So they felt that everyone was in the same position. When things started to reopen, their stress increased significantly because life was returning to normality. And what they said was that they had this analogy where they likened that whole process to being on a train platform. So they said that sort of that whole situation was like waiting for a train, and when you're waiting for a train, you're on the platform with everyone else. Everyone else is around you. You're all in the same boat. You're all waiting for a train, right? So everyone's in the same position, and then the train turns up. But instead, what happens is only some people are allowed on it, and then you see these people getting on, going off on their journey, doors closing, and you're left on the platform, and you're just watching these people continue their life, and you are left. And for me, like basically the theme ended up being called something like left out and left behind, and it was them, their idea of, I thought I was with everyone, and I hadn't been with everyone for such a long period of time, and now it's been taken away from me again. And I felt that was incredibly powerful, particularly that analogy has stuck with me a lot, like the idea of people just like leaving, being together and just leaving and just forgetting about them. And that is it. The stroke survivors and the brain injury survivors that I speak to quite a lot, they may not put it as eloquently as this analogy, but this idea of feeling left out and left behind, incredibly powerful, as this kind of discourse for understanding people with a disability, particularly a hidden disability as well. And it's something that has stuck with me and always makes me think when I'm talking to my participants and building studies about how we can improve this like inclusivity. And always, I feel like a lot of this podcast has come back to the same thing, but I feel like the key is that lack of awareness. It's, I don't think people were doing it from a position of sort of animosity. I don't think they were doing it out of anger or doing it, to sort of one-up people who weren't able to continue on with their lives. I just think there's this lack of awareness, and I think inherently, because they're not aware, they don't know how they're making other people feel. And I think that's a lot of what my research is. Since then, a lot of what my research is trying to push is this idea that, we're not going to change the world overnight, but we can take incremental steps to make people more aware through the research that we do, and try and promote a better understanding of what hidden disability is, of what chronic illness is, of what, how we do these particular things, how other people live. And I think that's important. I think that's the one thing that stuck with me, is the idea that there are other people living very different lives out there, and they just want to be seen, and not in like a in a way that's going to take much out of your life to see either. So I think that's the killer. It's just how can we raise that awareness and make people a bit more aware.
Yeah, definitely. And it's that's really interesting. That I love that train analogy as well. It sort of adds that visual sort of representation afterwards, because most people have been in a metro, like train station or whatever, and they all see people going on different directions and everything like that. So it's really visual. And for the listeners who haven't experienced anything, they would actually understand then a bit more about like stroke and stuff like that. And that's really interesting, and thank you for sharing that. Would you like to add anything?
No.
Great. So, thank you so much for Stephen for doing this, and doing your work as well about vision impairment and stroke and stuff like that. The more awareness that we'll have, the better. So thank you all for listening as well, and I hope you all enjoyed this podcast. And if you have any questions, you can either leave it in the comment section of this podcast or go over to my announcement video as well that I'm going to put up, or you can direct message me or email me at healthvision216@gmail.com if you want it more private. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'll see you all later. Bye.